So I'm joined in this video by Stephanie Williams, who served as the acting special representative of the Secretary General for Libya from March 2020 to February 2021. And in this short period marked by the COVID-19 pandemic, Stephanie succeeded in making significant progress in the Libya political process. But I think very interestingly also for this course, you designed a hybrid model of mediation which integrated in-person and digital interactions. So maybe you could start by telling us a little bit about what were the main characteristics of this model.
So thanks very much, Helena, and it's wonderful to be with you all today. Look, my main concern, what really drove my decision making was first and foremost the health and safety of our participants in the various tracks, as well, of course, as the UN team who, was accompanying me and them on this journey, and realizing that pulling together physical meetings in normal times, in Libya normal times, let me put that, is challenging. And to do it in the context of COVID and to ensure that all the health and safety measures would be in place would not only be logistically difficult, but also it would pose a strain on the organization's resources. So as we looked at building out particularly the political track of the intra-Libyan process, which there were three tracks, economic, military, and political, the political being the largest track with 75 Libyan participants. I immediately looked to how we could take advantage of online communications to start the conversation first with the group of 75, but then also to ensure that we had a more general buy-in from the Libyan public. Because of course, when you come to a political process, building legitimacy into a political track is very important, especially when essentially you've got 75 unelected representatives making major decisions for the country. So I decided that we needed the insertion of sub-tracks into the political track. And so I identified women, youth, and the Libyan municipalities as important sub-tracks to feed into the political process and to ensure that these voices were heard, but also to increase the sort of credibility of the process. And so what we did before we convened the actual physical Libyan political dialogue forum in Tunis in November was from sort of mid to late September through October through early November. We held a series of consultations with women's activists, NGOs, youth activists, and really the majority of the Libyan municipal councils from across the country. So this was really an intensive and exhaustive model. And what I discovered was the added benefit of being able to do this online was, in normal times, it would have been hard to bring all of these people, let's say, to Tripoli or Benghazi, because Libya is a huge country. It's 3 times the size of France. There are areas of the country where movement is very difficult. And so despite the fact that, the country was beset by, electrical blackouts, poor communications, we were able to connect with these people online and to have them participate in a process where, ironically, if it had been sort of normal times, they might not have been able to get on the road to access the meeting venues. So that was so that's what we did. And after the series of consultations with, overall, we consulted with over 200 women's activists, a similar number of youth activists across the country. And then, there's something like 130 Libyan municipal councils. And so variously we were talking to the mayors or other members of the municipal councils. And so what we did was, for each group, we identified a rapporteur, and then we convened the Libyan Political Dialogue Forum, first virtually, the end of the last week or the last week of October 2020. And we introduced sort of, the framework for the political dialogue. And then we had the rapporteurs from all of these groups report, to the 75 members of the Libyan Political Dialogue Forum. And so that they were able then to take that with them as they gathered, physically in Tunis. Now, the other thing that came out of these consultations, which I was then able to leverage with the group of 75, were calls for transparency, but also that this group of 75 be limited in to ensure that the forum did not become a forum for those who were there to serve their own purposes, to those who are looking to leverage their presence at the political forum for higher office, et cetera, to essentially buy some influence. So one thing that was born out of these consultations with the broader public was that I imposed a pledge of non-recusal. So each participant, the price of entry to the political dialogue was that each participant signed a pledge that they would recuse themselves from seeking any higher office during the interim period that would bridge the end of the dialogue to the convening of national elections. And as a result of that pledge, I must say, a half a dozen of those who were on the initial invite list dropped out, because it turned out that's exactly what they wanted to do. So that was good. And then I had them sign a code of ethics to govern their behavior during the political dialogue. And that, also, helped, I think, steer the process, particularly the use of hate speech inside the room when, people got out of hand. You'd wave the code of ethics at them, and they would, become more civil in their interactions. So that I think, that broader consultation, helped the mission to increase, to an extent, the credibility of the political process. The other thing that we did in conjunction with New York is that we set up digital dialogues in advance of the Tunis dialogue, and then through December, January, and then on the eve of the physical meeting in Geneva. And these digital dialogues were really successful. We had over 1,000 participants in each of the digital dialogues. So that, we had 5 dialogues, so that's 5,000 Libyans participate. At least 5,000 Libyans participated in these digital dialogues. Most of them, as we looked at the, age bracket, most of them were, younger, because they have more of a facility with digital communications. Initially, it was, not surprisingly, majority male, though with each dialogue, more and more women participated. In my view, not enough women participated, and we can get into that, how it's, online communications with women and the use of social media to threaten women in Libya, and what the mission did to curb that. But the digital dialogues were also very good, because we ran polls throughout these dialogues, which confirmed what we knew, which was that the vast majority of Libyans want national elections, and the vast majority wanted some kind of unified executive in advance of the elections. And so we were able to take that and to use it in the political dialogue to sort of keep everyone, grounded in the reality of what their compatriots wanted. but also to basically shake the status quo class, the political class that doesn't want any change because they were benefiting from the status quo. So those were very, very useful forums to insert into the political process.
Thanks, Stephanie. It's so fascinating to hear the sort of full extent of how you were able to combine the online and the offline. And I wanted to pull out just one thread at the beginning when you talked about the advantages of doing this hybrid model, which is really the ability to increase the participation of people who otherwise wouldn't be able to make it there physically. I've done a bunch of work also in similar contexts. We're currently running a consultation for women for the Office of the Special Envoy in Yemen. And one of the things that is always remarkable to me in these processes is how people manage to get online, even in circumstances where perhaps an initial assessment of connectivity would suggest that they weren't going to be able to, that there wouldn't be enough electricity, that there wouldn't be the ability to get online, but people really are able to do that. So there is an increase in participation, but I really liked how you then complicated that with some of the other issues around trust, around inclusivity, and around gender in particular. So if I can ask you just a follow-up question on each of these. So one is around the issue of trust, right, which is essential to any mediation process. I'd love to just hear a little bit more about what you did to build trust with the parties who were involved in any of these online components, and specifically how you think that the mechanisms for building trust differ from how you normally build trust in an offline process, in a process that doesn't have an online component. In other words, what are the kind of different dynamics of building trust in a virtual environment?
Well, I think just by virtue of the fact that it's a virtual environment, it's already much more transparent. You are removing the specter of the smoke-filled room, or in the context of Libya, the shisha smoke-filled room, where decisions are basically taken mostly by older men behind closed doors. And so by opening up now, there were concerns, of course, particularly when we got to the issue of voting mechanisms, how and if to do that online. And we ultimately decided that the actual vote on the executive itself needed to be held during a physical meeting. That there was too much vulnerability online to do that. We could go right up to that point, but the actual, voting process needed to be done online, but also that it needed to be done in an atmosphere of complete transparency, which is what I think distinguished the Geneva meeting in particular, even from the Tunis meeting. There was some transparency in Tunis, but because we were also, in the physical meeting in Tunis, these were people who many of them had not met each other since the revolution. We had parties who were on opposite sides of the conflict, and some, like the former regime members, who weren't even allowed into the political process at all. They had been excluded from every political process up to this point. And so to bring all these people together, you needed, to allow them time to reacquaint themselves with each other and for them to build trust. And then what we were able to do, I think, more widely with the broader Libyan community, and the mission immediately, at the moment that the 75 were identified, they were all under attack because there's 6 million Libyans who all wanted to be in the room. So how could we help them? And in this, identifying, the subgroups within the political dialogue, and in this, I would say the women and the youth distinguished themselves, but so did, for instance, the tribal leaders. And so to give them a platform, both online, but also in the physical meeting, so that they could, connect with people outside the room. And so that became important. But we also amplified their voices. The Libyans asked that I convey, in my press conferences, which I did, 2 press conferences during the Tunis meeting, And we did a number of press encounters between Tunis and Geneva that, I also, as the head of the mission, was tasked with conveying the outputs and the decisions. And so it was really sort of a gradualist approach of helping the Libyan public understand what was happening or what was going to happen, during the process, and then explaining why we were taking certain decisions. And so I will just say, for instance, during Tunis, we completed, the Libyan participants drafted and agreed on the roadmap that would guide the country to elections. They identified the election date. But because of there was still this lack of trust and confidence amongst the 75, it became clear to me that it was going to be a stretch to get the executive decided in that physical meeting. And that, in fact, it might be easier if we moved back online. And so we had to explain that to the Libyan public. And there was some disappointment, but there was also, I have to say, some relief, that we were being a bit deliberate, and my insistence that this was a Libyan-led process, in the sense that the Libyans were drafting the documents, the Libyans were discussing the documents, and the Libyans were deciding on the documents, that we were really there to facilitate the whole process. And so so there was a 2.5 month gap between Tunis and Geneva. And we really used that time, even during, we were meeting on Christmas Eve and right after Christmas online, just continual meetings, to see if we could, if the atmosphere was ripe to move the ball forward. And that's what happened really in January, when they agreed the mechanism for selection of the executive.
Yeah. Stephanie, one thing that's really interesting about the way you've described that process is how much of the trust building was really interlinked with transparency and inclusivity, and particularly transparency to the public, which of course is kind of a gold standard, but it can be challenging sometimes. So I'm very interested in hearing that in some ways having this hybrid process increase the transparency and the inclusivity as a way of building trust. I have a question about that, though, which is, do you think that because things become more transparent and more inclusive through the inclusion of digital processes, is there a loss of depth in the conversation? And in other words, do you fear that, if you just had a closed room with the shisha or without the shisha, but just a closed room, would the depth of the conversation be greater?
So that was always the key. So in both the military and the political tracks, I had to gauge when it was that we needed to meet physically. So with the military track, and that's just going back before the political talks in Tunis. In the military track, we had 2 physical meetings before the pandemic, both of them in Geneva, while the conflict was raging. The parties refused to meet in the same room, so we held parallel talks. Then, COVID hit, Hassan Salama left. We went online with the 2 delegations to the military commission. We nurtured them. We really worked online steadily through the spring. Then there was a cessation of hostilities in June. Then, they gradually warmed up to the idea of a physical meeting. And then, lo and behold, they came to us and they said, now we want to meet, please organize a physical meeting in Geneva. We're ready to talk. And, so we threw that together in October, and they came, they were ready to deal. They actually, because I think, and here I really credit the UNSMIL team, the military, the folks from our securities institution section, because they during that long period in the spring and summer where we were all in different locations and we could only meet the Libyans online, the guys in our mission, really nurtured, they tended the garden, let's put it that way. And so when the two sides came together, there was this comfortable atmosphere. And they, in fact, said, hey, thank you so much. We would like to spend a day and a half, just the two Libyan teams, together without the UN in the room. And I said, that is the best news that I've ever heard. So let's get out, let them talk. And they came to, we helped them a little bit with the ceasefire agreement, but the body of the ceasefire agreement was a Libyan product. And so they came with this and they were ready to sign. And so similarly with the political process, we achieved a lot in Tunis with the identification of the election state and the agreement on the broad roadmap and the prerogatives of the executive and eligibility criteria. But it wasn't until sort of mid-January that things became more ripe for moving on the executive. And at that point, because I had sensed that there was just this discomfort of doing this particular piece online, that a physical meeting was required. Now, so you have vulnerabilities online, but you also have vulnerabilities in physical meetings, which is that any time there's a physical process or a process to decide something like an interim executive, it becomes basically a mecca for all the other Libyans who want to influence the process. And this, again, we were sort of assisted by COVID, and that we put a bubble over the hotel in Tunis, and we put a bubble over the hotel in Geneva, and nobody except the delegates themselves or UN staff or the Swiss authorities could enter the venue. And that included, governments, who were sending governments sent delegations to both Tunis and Geneva, but they were not allowed near the venue. So this the influence peddling was basically limited to the phone. So what I decided to do in Geneva, and I have to say, there was even some hesitancy amongst my team, as I said, look, we just need to open this thing up. We need to shine a light on this process, because it's so important for Libyans to see what these guys are doing. So really from day one, almost all of the proceedings were aired online. And including the presentations by the 45 candidates. So I leveled the playing field for the candidates to make sure, again, it wasn't a process that was necessarily cooked in advance. And I have to say, in the end, the outcome was a surprise to many people. And I think it's because it was a dynamic and transparent, process. So, we aired all of the presentations online. The various votes that were taken were also broadcast live. We made the participants put their phones on the table, like they couldn't take their phones into the voting booth. I mean, just to eliminate, look, I mean, the whole issue of political corruption in Libya is a real issue for the public. And so they had to put their phones on a table. They couldn't take them into the voting booth in case there was you take a picture of your vote, then X, Y, and Z happens. So we eliminated that. You put your phone on a table, you go do your vote. And the whole thing was aired live, including, of course, the reading of the results. So and then we made the candidates sign all kinds of pledges to adhere to the roadmap for elections, pledges to honor a 30% quota for women in senior positions, pledges of financial integrity, pledges, so on and so forth. And all of those documents were shown to the Libyan public. And then after the vote, we convened the selected executive with the members of the Libyan Political Dialogue Forum for like a 3-hour session. That was also aired live.
Yeah, I think what's so fascinating about the way you describe this entire process is that you know, often when I speak to people about the use of digital technologies in complex situations, whether it's mediation or peace building, they'll say, you know, the transparency can really be a challenge. But there's no recognition of the challenges of the offline and how these might offset each other. So I think it's this idea that you sort of, you know, you use the transparency when it was strategic, but also offset it with the need for bubbles when that was relevant and important for the process. It's really interesting. I want to finish by going back to the question of women and the online space or the virtual space, which you raised yourself earlier, and you talked about the particular challenge of social media and women and the way that interactions happened. I just wondered if you could talk a little bit more about what issues you see specifically with the inclusion of women in digital processes or in hybrid processes, and what your experience was with that.
So, I mean, the overall challenge, of course, in the context of a conflict like the conflict in Libya, is that women for many years have been excluded from these discussions because, it's, you know, it was the guys carrying the guns, you know, the old guys who make the decisions in the country. You know, you give lip service to women. So I detected that very early on in the political process when there was a deliberate attempt to exclude women. And then that's when I basically insisted on a women's quota, which, you know, okay, that's also, you know, controversial, but the fact is, in these contexts, you need, I mean, women need to fight for their place at the table. But once they are at the table, you know, in this block that came to the Libyan Political Dialogue Forum was remarkable in their effectiveness. But they encountered a lot of social challenges, and first and foremost, it was online harassment. And so the mission has an arrangement with Facebook. And, you know, the minute that several of these women were harassed online, we immediately got on the horn with Facebook, and they took measures, you know, to either remove, there were fake accounts that were created. There were electronic armies that harassed specific women, took measures, you know, to remove all of that content immediately. I mean, like, you know, so Facebook was actually, and this is also in the context where Libya is a Facebook country. It is not a Twitter. It's a Facebook country. Libyans live online. They really live on Facebook. So it's very important for us to have that ability to get to the Facebook team and to alert them to this, because there is also a history in Libya of online harassment and use of hate speech leading to political violence, particularly against women. There's a member of parliament who was disappeared in eastern Libya in July 2019. You know, she had been a prominent voice, particularly against the military forces in the east. She had traveled to Benghazi, and she was violently abducted from her home. And she has never been seen or heard of since, nor have the perpetrators of this crime ever been brought to justice. So, you know, there's a real climate of violence and intimidation. During the Tunis dialogue itself, a prominent female activist in Benghazi was gunned down in the street in cold blood. And again, there's this huge lack of accountability all over Libya. And so to create a safe space for these women so that they could, they could do really the amazing things that they did in this process, which was they came together, 17 women came together as a block, and they lobbied successfully for the language that 30% of the senior positions in the interim executive go to women. That means ministers or deputy ministers, including in sovereign ministries. And so what happened, so we were able to take that, put that as a pledge to the candidates. Each candidate had to sign a pledge that they would honor that. And the gentleman who was selected as the prime minister, in fact, started to backslide in some of his public statements following the vote. And so immediately the women were able to take the pledge that he signed and say, hey, guy, you know, you committed to this publicly. He met with them. And as a result, I believe, of their active lobbying and their persistence, basically, we now have 2 women who have been appointed to sovereign ministries, foreign affairs and justice, and that is unprecedented in Libya.
That is remarkable. It's really remarkable. Thank you for sharing that. I think that's a really important aspect of this process to really understand. And Stephanie, I want to ask you one last question in closing, which is to kind of look beyond the Libya process and think about this hybrid model of mediation. You know, obviously, in a way, you've talked a fair amount about COVID-19 and the pandemic and how that created certain conditions that accelerated this kind of hybrid model. But do you think it's a model that's here to stay? Do you think it'll continue to happen after pandemic restrictions are lifted?
I hope so. I hope we just don't revert to the old ways of doing business, because I think it has some inherent advantages. You don't want to overly rely on online, because you do need physical meetings, you know, particularly in these cultures. So, I mean, you know, in the Middle East, the oral tradition, you know, being so important. So, you know, here I think of tribal sheikhs who were invited to the dialogue, who, you know, would sit and they would listen to the political forces and, you know, these guys who've been clinging to their seats for, you know, 8 to 9 years, and they would listen, and then they would get up and they would speak. They would use you know, poetry. They would cite, you know, Libyan, you know, cultural and social traditions. You know, but they would speak a very national discourse, and it would it was so important and appropriate for them to frame what was happening in a wider context, not just inside the bubble of the room. So those kind of interventions, you know, you can have them online, but they're not as effective as when you've got one of these gentlemen standing up in a room and, you know, bringing the weight. Like we had a tribal sheikh from the largest tribe in Libya, and, you know, I mean, when that guy spoke, a lot of people listened, because he had behind him, you know, centuries of tribal tradition, which is, you know, you don't want to overemphasize that. You have to counterbalance that with, you know, coexistence in the modern world, but it's an element which you can't ignore. So you don't want to overly emphasize the online moving forward, but particularly for those populations who don't have the means or the ability to access physical meetings, you know, I think you should continue, and the mission, you know, the UN mission should look, you know, to you know, using online, particularly for groups who are more comfortable online now, youth, civil society, you know, to an extent, you know, women's activists, you know, so on and so forth. So yes, I think it should be continued moving forward.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. It was a pleasure to hear your thoughts on this.
Super, Helena. Well, thanks so much.